The night smelled of smoke long before anyone understood what was happening. Somewhere near the Circus Maximus, a small flame appeared among wooden stalls packed tightly together beneath the summer sky. At first, nobody paid attention. Rome had seen fires before, but this one was different. The wind carried sparks across rooftops, leaping from building to building with terrifying speed. Within hours, entire streets were glowing orange. Families rushed into the darkness carrying children, blankets, and whatever possessions they could hold in trembling hands. Temple bells echoed through the night. Dogs barked, people screamed, and above it all, a city that believed itself eternal began to burn. For 6 days and 7 nights, the greatest city in the world became an ocean of fire. Marble cracked from the heat. Ancient shrines disappeared beneath collapsing roofs. The sky turned black with smoke visible for miles beyond the walls of Rome. And as the flames consumed the capital of an empire, a rumor began spreading through the frightened crowds. A rumor that would survive for nearly 2,000 years. They whispered that the emperor was watching, that while Rome burned, Nero sang. Whether the story was true hardly mattered, because from that moment onward, Nero would become something larger than a man, a monster to some, a victim to others, an artist trapped inside the body of an emperor, a ruler remembered as Rome's greatest villain and perhaps its most misunderstood. Tonight, as the city sleeps beneath the stars, we will travel back to the marble streets, crowded markets, imperial palaces, and shadowed corridors of the Roman world, and together we will discover the life of the man history calls Nero. His name was Nero. He was the last of the the dynasty that Augustus had founded, and his story is one of the most dramatic in the long and dramatic history of Rome. It involves murder and music, fire and philosophy, conspiracy and madness, and the particular loneliness of absolute power. It involves a man who may have been worse than his reputation suggests, or better than it suggests, depending on which sources you read and how much weight you give to the people who wrote them. We are going to take our time with this. We are going to go slowly through the whole of it. The world he was born into, and the childhood that shaped him, and the reign that defined him, and the death that ended it. Every detail we can find, every texture of the era. The way the Romans ate and dressed and worshipped and fought, the way power worked and the way it failed. The way one young man, at the center of all of it, navigated the most complicated. Breathe slowly, let yourself settle. The story begins before Nero was born. The Roman Empire in the middle of the 1st century AD was a thing of staggering scale and complexity. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal and Spain in the west to the Euphrates River in the east, from the forests of Scotland in the north to the deserts of North Africa and Egypt in the south. Within those boundaries lived perhaps 60 to 70 million people, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, living in landscapes as varied as the Rhine marshes and the Saharan edge and the olive-terraced hills of Greece. They were connected by roads that were so well engineered that some of them are still visible today, by a common currency, by the Latin language of administration and law, and by the single fact of Roman military dominance, which was the foundation everything else rested on. The city of Rome itself, at the center of all this, was unlike anything else in the world at that time. A population of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people lived in it, an almost incomprehensible density for the ancient world. They were packed into apartment buildings called insulae that rose sometimes to 6 or 7 stories, precarious constructions of brick and timber that caught fire regularly and collapsed occasionally and were constantly being rebuilt. The streets between them were narrow and dark and loud with the sound of cartwheel iron on stone. because wheeled traffic was banned from the city center during daylight hours, and so all the deliveries and the heavy transport happened at night, which meant that Rome never really slept. The noise of the carts and the shouts of the drivers and the barking of dogs went on through the small hours, and the wealthy, who could afford houses with thick walls and gardens, simply endured it, and the poor, who lived in the upper floors of the insulae, endured it more immediately. The smell of ancient Rome is something that the marble monuments and the archaeological reconstructions never quite convey. It was a city of 1 million people with inadequate sewage, with animals in the streets, with food being cooked over charcoal braziers in every apartment, with tanneries and fulleries processing leather and cloth with urine, with fish sauce being produced in coastal facilities and transported to the city in amphorae, with the bodies of the poor being disposed of in pits outside the city walls. It was a city of extraordinary beauty in its public spaces and of considerable squalor in its residential districts, and both of these things were simultaneously true, and both contributed to the atmosphere that Nero would spend his life in. The political system of Rome at this time was the Principate, which was the arrangement that Augustus had created after the civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination. It was nominally a republic, with all the traditional republican institutions intact. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, the magistrates still performed their functions. But in practice, all real power resided in one man, the Princeps, the first citizen, who controlled the armies and the treasury and the foreign policy and the judicial system through a combination of formal powers and informal authority that made the republican institutions largely decorative. This system had an inherent tension that was never resolved. The emperor needed to pretend to be merely the first among equals, while actually being an absolute monarch. The Senate needed to pretend to be a genuine deliberative body, while actually being an advisory body that the emperor could ignore. Both sides of this pretense were maintained with varying degrees of effort and conviction by different emperors and different senators. And the history of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty is substantially the history of this tension, playing out in specific human relationships, in the complicated dance between princeps and aristocracy that could, when it went wrong, become lethal. Augustus had managed this dance brilliantly. He was patient and tactful and understood the performance of republican modesty, even while accumulating unprecedented personal power. He called himself Augustus rather than king or dictator. He wore the toga rather than purple robes. He attended Senate meetings as a participant rather than presiding as a sovereign. And this performance was convincing enough that most Romans chose to be convinced by it after a century of civil war. The stability he offered was worth the price of pretending the republic still existed. His successors were less skilled at the performance. Tiberius was able and cold and contemptuous of the flattery the Senate offered him. He found the performance of republican consultation insulting to everyone's intelligence and said so, which did not endear him to the senators who depended on the performance for their own dignity. His reign became increasingly dark and paranoid. The treason trials multiplied, the informers flourished, and he withdrew to Capri and governed the empire from a distance, while Rome filled with fear. Caligula came after Tiberius and began with a burst of popular joy that quickly curdled into something else. He was young and apparently damaged by the years of growing up under Tiberius. He did things that struck even his contemporaries as bizarre and cruel, and he was assassinated after less than 4 years, leaving the palace in disorder and the question of succession dangerously open. Claudius was found hiding behind a curtain in the Imperial palace by Praetorian guardsmen who needed an emperor urgently and who found one in the most unlikely place. Claudius was Caligula's uncle, a man who had survived the dangerous previous reigns, partly by appearing harmless, partly because his physical disabilities made him seem unthreatening. He had a pronounced stammer and an unsteady gait that had led his family to treat him as slow. But he was, in fact, deeply learned and administratively capable, and his reign was on the whole successful. He conquered Britain, he managed the frontiers competently, he reformed the administration, and he survived for 13 years before dying in circumstances that many at the time believed were not accidental. It was in this world, during Claudius's reign, that Nero was born. His full name at birth was Lucius Domitius. He was born on the 15th of December in 37 AD in Antium on the Latian coast, the same town where Caligula had been born, which was one of the early coincidences that the superstitious Romans would later interpret as meaningful. His father was Gnaeus Domitius, a man from one of the great old aristocratic families of Rome, a man whose family name meant bronze beard, and who was described by the historian Suetonius as utterly despicable in every aspect of his life. A man who had killed a freedman for refusing to drink as much as he was told to, who had deliberately run over a child with his chariot on the Appian Way, who had punched a Roman knight who criticized him and gouged out his eyes, who had been convicted of fraud and adultery and treason, and who escaped punishment only because Tiberius died before sentence was carried out. His mother was Agrippina the younger, daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, and the fierce Agrippina the elder, sister of Caligula, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ambition and ruthlessness, who had survived the dangerous years of Caligula's reign and who would go on to become one of the most powerful women in Roman history. She was not yet 22 when Nero was born, already marked by the violence and the loss that had shaped her family for a generation, already possessed of the calculating quality that would define her adult life. There is a story told about the circumstances of his birth, that when Agrippina asked her brother Caligula what name she should give her child, he pointed to his uncle Claudius and said Claudius as a joke, because Claudius was, at that time, considered a figure of ridicule, and Agrippina laughed and gave the child a different name. The story may or may not be true, but it establishes something about the atmosphere of the imperial family, a world in which cruelty and humor were inseparable, and in which the boundaries between affection and danger were never entirely clear. His father died when he was about 2.5 years old, and almost immediately his situation became precarious. His mother Agrippina was exiled by her brother Caligula, accused of conspiracy, sent to the island of Pontia, and the child's property was confiscated by the state. He was left in the care of his father's sister, Domitia Lepida, who was herself not a warm or nurturing figure by most accounts. He grew up initially in a household without his mother, without real security, dependent on the goodwill of people who had their own reasons to be complicated about the relationship. When Caligula was assassinated and Claudius became emperor, Agrippina was recalled from exile and her property restored, and the young Lucius was returned to her. But the early years of displacement and instability were formative in ways that his later behavior arguably reflected. The capacity for both great charm and sudden, cold violence, the desperate hunger for admiration that would manifest in his artistic career, the deep suspicion of those closest to him. All of these things are not surprising in a child who had experienced very early the arbitrary nature of power and the way it could transform your life overnight. Claudius's reign was the context of Nero's childhood and adolescence, and understanding that reign helps explain both how Nero came to power and what kind of imperial culture he had grown up in. Claudius governed through a highly capable group of freedmen, former slaves who had been educated and trained in the imperial household. and who ran the practical machinery of administration. Men like Narcissus and Pallas, who were enormously powerful and enormously wealthy, and who were resented by the Senate precisely because their power came from the emperor's personal household rather than from the traditional structures of Roman aristocratic life. This reliance on freedmen was one of the most controversial aspects of Claudius's reign, and it represented something genuinely new in how the empire was being administered. It was a more bureaucratic model, more dependent on professional administrators rather than on the inherited connections of the aristocracy, and it pointed toward the kind of imperial administration that would eventually characterize the later empire. But in the Claudian period, it was deeply offensive to the Senate and the noble families who felt their traditional role being bypassed. Claudius had a complicated personal life. He had been married several times, and his marriages tended to end badly. His third wife, Messalina, was, according to the sources, one of the most spectacularly behaved women in Roman history. She was young and apparently sexually voracious and politically careless, and she was eventually executed in 48 AD. Emerged that she had conducted a public marriage ceremony with one of her lovers while Claudius was away from Rome, which was not primarily a moral offense, but a political one because it could have been used as the basis for a coup. After Messalina's execution, Claudius was persuaded, through the influence of his freedman Pallas, to marry his niece, Agrippina, Nero's mother. The marriage required a special decree from the Senate, because marriages between uncles and nieces were normally prohibited under Roman law. And the fact that the Senate passed this decree tells us something about both the power of the imperial family and the flexibility of Roman law when the emperor wanted something. Agrippina had been maneuvering toward this marriage for years, or so the ancient sources suggest. And once it was accomplished, she moved quickly and effectively to advance her son's position. She persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero formally, which he did in 58, making the boy a member of the Julio-Claudian family and giving him the name Nero. Claudius Caesar, Drusus Germanicus, an aggregation of prestigious names that signaled clearly where Agrippina intended her son to end up. She also arranged for the best possible education. She appointed as Nero's tutor the Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, one of the greatest minds of the age, a man whose philosophical writings on ethics and the nature of the good life are still read today, whose prose style was among the most admired in Latin literature, and who had himself experienced the dangers of imperial Rome firsthand. Having been exiled to Corsica by Claudius on charges of adultery with Caligula's sister that were probably politically motivated, Seneca had been recalled from Corsica by Agrippina, and the appointment as Nero's tutor was his rehabilitation and his reward. The relationship between Seneca and Nero is one of the more complex and more poignant in Roman history. Seneca genuinely tried to educate the boy in philosophy and rhetoric and the principles of good governance, and he had real influence on the young Nero's intellectual development. Nero grew up with a genuine love of the arts and of learning that was not simply performance, but reflected a real aesthetic sensibility that Seneca's education had cultivated. Seneca also wrote speeches for the young emperor in the early years of the reign and functioned as a kind of prime minister, and the tension between the philosophical principles he taught and the political realities he helped manage was never entirely resolved and eventually became impossible. The other major influence of Nero's adolescence and early reign was Sextus Afranius Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who, along with Seneca, formed the pair of advisors who effectively governed Rome in the early years of Nero's reign, while the young emperor was finding his feet. Burrus was a soldier, practical and loyal, and with no particular philosophical pretensions. But he was also honest and capable and genuinely committed to good governance in the way that a competent professional soldier can be. He and Seneca complemented each other, and the combination worked well for several years. Claudius died on the 13th of October in 54 AD, and the ancient sources are virtually unanimous in their belief that he was poisoned. The debates are about by whom and with what, rather than about whether. The most widely believed account is that Agrippina arranged for mushrooms to be poisoned, specific mushrooms that Claudius was known to be fond of, and that the poison was administered by a woman named Locista, who was a specialist in such things. Claudius ate the mushrooms, became ill, and died. And within hours, Nero had been presented to the Praetorian Guard and acclaimed emperor. He was 16 years old. The accession of a 16-year-old boy in a political system that had no formal succession mechanism was always going to involve the informal and powerful influence of the adults around him. And the early years of Nero's reign are often called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years, a period when the empire was governed well, and Nero himself was, by all accounts, an accessible and apparently benevolent young ruler. This period is associated primarily with the influence of Seneca and Burrus, who kept the worst instincts of both Nero and Agrippina in check, and who conducted practical governance with considerable competence. The things Nero did in these early years were largely good by the standards of his era and position. He reduced the burden of indirect taxes. He tried to reform the court system. He gave the Senate more genuine deliberative authority than it had exercised under the later years of Claudius. He was generous with public entertainments and popular with the people of Rome. He prohibited gladiatorial combat in the provinces, which he found distasteful. He presided over a period of considerable artistic and cultural activity, and he presented himself as a student of philosophy who intended to rule on philosophical principles. He also, in this period, demonstrated the artistic ambitions that would define his self-image for the rest of his life, and that would complicate his relationship with the Roman aristocracy in ways that never resolved. He sang, he played the cithara, he wrote poetry, he appeared in theatrical performances, and all of these activities were, by the standards of the Roman aristocracy, deeply inappropriate for a person of his rank. In the Roman social hierarchy, artistic performance was associated with slaves and freedmen and social inferiors. A Roman nobleman might appreciate the arts, might commission works, might be known as a patron, but to actually perform was to lower yourself into the social category of the performer. And the Roman aristocracy found Nero's insistence on performing personally both baffling and offensive. This was not simply snobbery. It was connected to deep Roman ideas about dignity, about what was appropriate for a person of rank, about the relationship between self-control and social position. The Stoic philosophy that Seneca taught was particularly emphatic about the importance of maintaining appropriate gravity and self-command, and an emperor who got on a stage and sang was, from this perspective, failing at something fundamental. Nero did not agree. Or rather, he understood the criticism and disagreed with it. He seems to have genuinely believed that the arts were important, and that performing in them was a form of excellence rather than degradation. And this belief put him in constant tension with the aristocratic culture he was nominally the head of. The relationship with his mother, Agrippina, was, from the beginning of the reign, extremely complicated. She had put him on the throne. She had managed the succession with remarkable effectiveness, and she fully expected to be rewarded with a corregency in everything but name. She expected to exercise real power through her son, and she did exercise it in the early months of the reign. Her name appeared on coins alongside Nero's. She sat with him when he received ambassadors. She participated in governmental business in ways that had no precedent in Roman imperial history. This was not sustainable, and both Seneca and Burrus understood that it was not sustainable. A woman exercising imperial power was simply outside what Roman political culture could accommodate, and they worked to reduce her influence, replacing her allies and supporters with their own people, gradually marginalizing her from the center of power without directly confronting her. This was a delicate and partly successful effort, and it contributed to the growing tension between Nero and his mother that would eventually reach its terrible conclusion. Nero's first marriage was to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius and Messalina, who had been betrothed to him as part of the political arrangements that accompanied his adoption into the Claudian family. Octavia was, by all accounts, a dignified and blameless young woman who was also entirely unsuited to Nero's temperament. She was reserved where he was flamboyant, serious where he was artistic, connected to the old Claudian dynastic past in ways that he found constraining. The marriage was politically necessary but personally meaningless, and Nero largely ignored her in favor of a freedwoman named Acta, with whom he fell genuinely in love. The affair with Acta was one of the few truly simple things in Nero's complicated life. She was a woman from the East, possibly from a wealthy Asiatic family, who had been enslaved and who had come into the imperial household. She and Nero were apparently genuinely fond of each other in a way that his formal relationships rarely allowed. She remained loyal to him throughout his life and was one of the people who helped with his burial after his death, which tells us something about the quality of whatever passed between them. Agrippina disapproved of the affair, which was not itself unusual. Mothers of emperors disapproved of many things, but her disapproval became another point of tension in a relationship that was accumulating points of tension at an alarming rate. She opposed the affair with Acta. She opposed Nero's artistic activities. She tried to maintain her influence over government business, and Nero began to resist her in ways that escalated gradually from the minor to the catastrophic. The story of Poppaea, Sabina, enters here, because Poppaea was the woman who would eventually replace Octavia as Nero's wife and who would, according to most ancient sources, accelerate the final break between Nero and his mother. Poppaea was one of the most beautiful and most intelligent women in Rome. She was married to a man named Rufrius Crispinus, and then to Marcus Salvius, who was one of Nero's close friends. She was witty and cultivated, and utterly ruthless in her ambition. She understood Nero's desires, and flattered them, and pointed them in directions that served her own interests with a skill that the ancient sources find both admirable and terrifying. She apparently encouraged Nero's resentment of his mother. She apparently persuaded him that Agrippina was attempting to control and constrain him in ways that were incompatible with his authority and his freedom. She may have genuinely believed this, or she may have been using the mother-son tension as a lever to advance her own position, or both. And Nero, who was, by this point, 20 years old and increasingly impatient with the constraints that the adults in his life had imposed since childhood, was receptive to these arguments. The decision to kill Agrippina was not made quickly or lightly. At least that is the impression the ancient sources give. Nero tried several less drastic approaches. First, he tried to reduce her influence by removing her supporters. He tried to humiliate her publicly. He tried to frighten her by having her property stripped and her bodyguard removed. None of this resolved the fundamental tension, and eventually, in 59 AD, he made the decision that was among the most shocking acts of his reign and among the most discussed in Roman history. The method he chose for the assassination was elaborate and ultimately unsuccessful in its initial form. He had constructed a boat with a collapsible lead ceiling designed to crush his mother when she was aboard it. He invited her to a festival at Baiae on the Bay of Naples and then sent her home on this boat. The sealing mechanism failed to work properly, and Agrippina, an excellent swimmer, survived the ship sinking by swimming to shore. She sent a messenger to Nero, telling him she had survived a near accident and was safe. Nero, hearing this, understood that she had understood, and he sent soldiers to her villa on the shore who stabbed her to death. The ancient sources report that she bared her belly to the soldiers and told them to strike it first, the womb that had borne Nero. It is the kind of death scene that is almost too dramatic to be entirely believed, but that has nevertheless been preserved in multiple sources, and that captures something true about the particular quality of the relationship, even at its end. Even as the soldiers came, the dynamic was about her body, her motherhood, her son, the thing she had made and that had turned on her. Nero's reaction to the murder, according to the sources, was a mixture of relief and horror, and the particular kind of guilt that attaches itself permanently to a person who has done something irrevocable. He apparently feared the darkness for years afterward. He reportedly saw visions of his mother's ghost. He had difficulty sleeping in the room where she had slept. The Senate dutifully passed decrees congratulating him on surviving a conspiracy his mother had allegedly been mounting against him, which was the official version, and which everyone knew was a fiction. Seneca wrote the letter explaining this fiction to the Senate, which was one of the compromises that eventually became impossible for him to sustain. The years that followed the murder of Agrippina saw a gradual darkening of Nero's reign. The constraints that Seneca and Burrus had maintained loosened as Nero grew more confident and less willing to be governed by his advisors. Burrus died in 62 AD, probably of cancer, though some sources suggest poison, and his replacement as Praetorian prefect was Gaius Aphonius Tigellinus, a man of very different character, ambitious and cruel, and entirely willing to use the instruments of imperial power for personal gain and for the execution of whoever his emperor wanted eliminated. Seneca, after Burrus's death, gradually withdrew from active governance. He was increasingly uncomfortable with what was being done in Nero's name, and increasingly aware that his own philosophical reputation was being compromised by his association with it. He asked Nero's permission to retire and to return his substantial wealth to the emperor, which was a gesture of withdrawal from the dangerous proximity to power that had defined his life for more than a decade. Nero refused the formal retirement, but Seneca withdrew anyway, spending his last years writing philosophy and waiting for the end he probably knew was coming. The divorce from Octavia and marriage to Poppaea was another step in the direction Nero was traveling. It required first accusing Octavia of adultery, which nobody believed, then exiling her, then having her executed when her continued existence seemed politically dangerous. Octavia was 20 when she died, and the people of Rome, who had followed these events with the avid interest that the imperial family always attracted, were apparently genuinely grieved by her death. There were demonstrations in her favor that the authorities suppressed. There were expressions of public sympathy that indicated that the population understood what was happening even if they could not prevent it. Poppaea became empress in 62 AD, and she was pregnant by the time of her marriage, which underlined the dynastic purpose of the whole arrangement. She bore a daughter in 63 AD, who died after 3 months, which was a grief genuinely felt, and she was pregnant again in 65 AD when she died. The ancient sources most commonly attribute her death to a kick from Nero in a fit of rage, which may be true, may be an exaggeration of something that happened during an argument, or may be a fiction created to blacken his reputation further. We cannot know. What is certain is that she died, and that Nero was extravagant in his grief. He refused to have her cremated in the normal Roman fashion, and had her body embalmed in the Eastern manner and interred with enormous ceremony. And he deified her, which was an honor normally reserved for emperors, and which, in this case, expressed something that looked very much like genuine sorrow. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days, beginning on the night of July 18th in 64 AD, and the story of this fire is so entangled with legend and with the question of Nero's responsibility that separating them has occupied historians for 2 millennia. The fire started in or near the Circus Maximus in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The precise location was one where fires were common, because the circus was bordered by shops and market stalls selling flammable goods. And in the summer heat, with a wind blowing, fire there had the potential to spread rapidly through the densely packed insulae of the surrounding neighborhoods. And spread it did. It burned for 6 days before being brought under control, and then broke out again in a different district. 3 of Rome's 14 regions were completely destroyed, and 7 more were severely damaged. The Cælian Hill and the Aventine were devastated. Parts of the Palatine, including sections of the Imperial Palace, were burned. Ancient temples and historic buildings, and the accumulated private wealth of centuries went up in smoke. The human cost was enormous, though impossible to quantify precisely. People died in the initial fire and in the chaos. People were displaced by the hundreds of thousands. The economic disruption was profound. Nero was at Antium when the fire started, about 30 miles south of Rome, and he returned to the city immediately. The ancient sources acknowledge this, even as they preserve the story of him playing his cithara and singing while Rome burned. This story, which is the most famous image of Nero in popular imagination, is almost certainly false, or at most a distant distortion of something that may have happened much later. The source for it is Cassius Dio, who was writing a century and a half after the event. And even Dio's version is ambiguous about when and where the music playing happened. What is certain is that Nero did return to Rome, did organize relief efforts, did open his own gardens and public buildings as shelters for the displaced, did arrange for emergency supplies of grain to be brought in and sold at reduced prices. What is also certain is that the question of who started the fire was live in Rome immediately, and the most popular suspect was Nero himself. The ancient sources report this suspicion and debate it. Tacitus, writing 40 or 50 years after the event, says it was unclear whether the fire was accidental or the result of Nero's criminal intent, and presents both the case for accidental fire and the case for deliberate arson with genuine evidence. Modern historians are divided. Some find the evidence for deliberate arson unconvincing, noting that Nero was in Antium when it started and that fires in this part of Rome were genuinely common. Others find suspicious the reports that people prevented firefighting efforts and that the fire broke out in suspicious secondary locations. What happened after the fire is in some ways more revealing than the fire itself. Nero launched an ambitious reconstruction program for Rome that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely forward-looking in its urban planning. The new city was to be built with wider streets, with buildings separated by open spaces to prevent fire spreading, with height limits on apartment buildings, with porticos along the street fronts to provide shelter and access. These were genuine improvements over the chaotic organic city that had burned, and the new Rome that emerged from the reconstruction was in many ways a better functioning city. But Nero also, amid the reconstruction of Rome, built something for himself. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous complex of buildings and gardens and artificial landscapes that occupied a vast section of central Rome that had been cleared by the fire. The ancient sources describe it with a mixture of awe and outrage. Suetonius says the vestibule was large enough to contain a colossal statue of Nero 300 feet high, that there was a triple colonnade a mile long, that there was a lake, like a sea, with buildings around it, representing cities, that the dining rooms had ceilings of fretted ivory that opened to shower flowers and perfumes on the guests below. The Golden House was everything that Roman aristocratic values said an emperor should not build. It was the expression of unlimited personal ambition in the form of architecture. It occupied land that had previously been densely inhabited, and that the fire had cleared, which was why many Romans believed Nero had started the fire specifically to clear this land. And whether this was true or not, the political and symbolic damage of building it was real. The charge that Nero had destroyed the city to build himself a pleasure palace was one that stuck regardless of its truth. The response to the popular anger about the fire was the persecution of the Christians. And this event, which is one of the most consequential in the history of the early church, needs to be understood in its specific context rather than through the retrospective lens of later Christian history. In 64 AD, Christianity was a small and obscure sect, mostly known in Rome as a subdivision of the Jewish community, and the Romans found it baffling and somewhat sinister because its members refused to worship any gods except their own, which made them atheists in Roman terms, and because there were rumors about their practices, rumors of secret meetings and strange rituals and exclusivity that set them apart from the normal life of the city. Tacitus, who is generally hostile to Nero, but who also finds the Christians an unpleasant group, writes that Nero found in the Christians a convenient scapegoat for the fire and arranged for their arrest and punishment. The punishments were extreme even by Roman standards. Tacitus describes people being sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, describes people being burned as living torches in Nero's gardens. And while some of these details may be exaggerated, the general outline of a significant persecution is confirmed by multiple sources. What is disputed is whether Nero was directly responsible for initiating it, whether it was a genuine attempt to fix blame for the fire or simply an exploitation of popular resentment against an already unpopular group, and whether the persecution was widespread and sustained or concentrated in Rome and relatively brief. Peter and Paul, two of the most important figures in early Christianity, both died in Rome during this period. Tradition has them dying during Nero's persecution, and whether this tradition is accurate in its specific details, the general context of danger for Christians in Rome during Nero's reign is historically solid. The persecution of 64 AD marked a turning point in the relationship between Rome and Christianity and in the self-understanding of the early church. And Nero's name was attached to this persecution with a permanence that was one of the most consequential aspects of his historical reputation. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD was the most serious attempt on Nero's life, and it reflected the depth of the opposition his reign had created among the Roman aristocracy. The conspiracy was led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a man of great wealth and good family and considerable personal charm, and it involved a significant number of senators, equestrians, and even some praetorian officers. The plan was to assassinate Nero at the Circus Maximus during the Games of Ceres and to replace him with Piso. The plan was betrayed before it could be executed. An enslaved person belonging to one of the conspirators informed on the plot, and the arrests began immediately. The investigation that followed used torture systematically, and the investigations expanded rapidly as arrested conspirators named others under questioning. The resulting executions swept through the upper classes of Rome with a thoroughness that was genuinely shocking even by the standards of an era that was accustomed to political violence. Among those who died was Seneca, Nero's former tutor, who was accused of knowing about the conspiracy. Whether he actually did is uncertain. He was required to open his veins, the traditional Roman aristocratic form of compelled suicide, and he died with the philosophical equanimity that his Stoic writings had described, dictating to scribes while his life ran out, surrounded by his friends, as composed as a man who has been thinking about death for decades can be when it finally arrives. The poet Lucan, who had been Seneca's nephew and Nero's early friend, and who had turned against him for reasons that probably included artistic jealousy. Nero had reportedly banned Lucan from publishing or reciting his work, also died, reciting lines from his own epic poem, the Pharsalia, as he died, which was another kind of final performance. And then Petronius Arbiter, the author of the Satyricon, who had been Nero's arbiter of elegance, his guide in matters of taste and refinement, who died with the same aristocratic deliberateness, writing a detailed account of Nero's sexual practices and mailing it to the emperor before sealing his wounds, which was a final act of defiance that was also a kind of art. There is something worth noting about all these deaths. The way that educated Romans of this era approached compelled suicide with a kind of philosophical performance, using the manner of their dying to make a statement. It was a culture in which death was a final act of self-presentation, and in which the courage and composure of your dying was a legitimate measure of your character. Stoic philosophy, in particular, had a lot to say about the good death and about the freedom that the ability to choose death gave even to people in otherwise powerless positions. And many of the people who died during Nero's reign died in ways that reflected this tradition, and that drew on it for their final dignity. The war in Britain, the rebellion of Boudica, was happening simultaneously with many of these internal Roman events, and it is a useful reminder that the reign of Nero was not only the story of court politics and artistic ambitions and conspiracies. It was also the story of an empire being administered, however imperfectly, across an enormous geographic range. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia, whose husband's death had led to the Roman annexation of his kingdom and the brutal treatment of his family, and who led a revolt that burned Colchester and London and St. Albans and killed perhaps 80,000 Roman citizens and allies before being defeated in a battle whose location has been debated ever since. The revolt was suppressed by the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who conducted the campaign with considerable skill and ruthlessness. But the fact that it had happened at all was evidence of the cost of the Roman lay approach to governing recently conquered territories. The extraction of tribute and the treatment of native aristocracies as subjects rather than partners was a formula that generated resentment and occasional violent resistance. And the Boudican revolt was perhaps the most dramatic example of this in Britain. Nero's response to the revolt, after it was suppressed, was actually more moderate than the governor's instinct. He recalled Paulinus and replaced him with a more conciliatory administrator, which suggests that whatever was happening in Rome, the machinery of imperial governance continued to function, and that there were people capable of making reasonable policy judgments. This moderation is part of the picture that the purely sensational accounts of Nero's reign tend to omit. The war with Parthia over Armenia was another significant military and diplomatic challenge of the reign, and it was managed with considerable competence by the general Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, who fought a successful campaign and eventually negotiated a settlement that established a compromise over an Armenian succession that was generally favorable to Rome, and that held for several decades. Corbulo was one of the best generals Rome produced in the 1st century, and his campaigns represent one of the genuine military achievements of Nero's reign. Corbulo later killed himself on Nero's orders, which is one of the most baffling and self-destructive acts of the later reign. The loss of one of his best commanders to paranoid suspicion was the kind of thing that suggested the Decision-making at the center of the empire was becoming unreliable in ways that mattered beyond the internal politics of Rome. The revolt in Judea that began in 66 AD was another crisis that the reign of Nero would pass on to his successors without resolving. The revolt was the result of the accumulated grievances of the Jewish population of Judea against the Roman administration, against the abuses of successive procurators, against the general treatment of a proud and theologically particular people. The revolt began with violence in Jerusalem, spread rapidly, and the general Vespasian was sent with a substantial force to suppress it. He was in the middle of this campaign when Nero died, and everything changed. The artistic ambitions that had defined Nero's self-image found their fullest expression in the tours of Greece in 67 AD, which was one of the most extraordinary episodes of his reign, and one that tells us something essential about what he actually wanted from life and what he understood himself to be. He went to Greece to compete in the great Pan-Hellenic Games, the Olympics and the Pythian Games, and the Isthmian Games, and the Nemean Games. He competed in musical contests and chariot races and theatrical performances. And he won. He won every contest he entered, which was not surprising given that he was the emperor of Rome and the judges were not making decisions in a vacuum. But the winning mattered less than the competing. He genuinely wanted to be there, genuinely wanted to be judged as an artist and a performer among the Greeks who had invented the tradition he was participating in. And the Greeks, who understood this and who were politically astute enough to know what the emperor wanted, gave him what he came for. He was acclaimed, celebrated, crowned with the victor's wreaths. And he was apparently genuinely happy in a way that the sources convey even as they find it embarrassing. He proclaimed the freedom of Greece from Roman taxation at the Isthmus, which was a popular gesture with obvious political benefits, but which may also have been a genuine expression of his admiration for Greek culture. The Romans had a complicated relationship with Greek culture throughout the Republican and Imperial periods. They admired it and borrowed from it extensively, while maintaining a certain competitive insistence on the superiority of Roman virtue and Roman practical accomplishment. Nero was unusual in seeming to genuinely prefer Greek cultural forms to Roman ones, and in being willing to say so publicly. The crisis that ended his reign began to build while he was still in Greece. The governor of a province in Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, raised a revolt against him in 68 AD, citing the tyrannical nature of his government. Vindex was not himself a candidate for emperor, but he called on Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania, to take the throne. The legions in Upper Germany, which were loyal to Nero, defeated and killed Vindex. But the revolt had set something in motion that the military victory could not stop. Nero returned to Rome from Greece to find that the situation was developing in ways he could not control. The Praetorian Guard, under its new prefect Nymphidius Sabinus, defected to Galba. And without the guard, Nero's position in Rome was untenable. The Senate declared him a public enemy, which was the formal legal mechanism by which a Roman citizen could be killed without legal process. And the traditional punishment for a public enemy was being beaten to death while the head was fixed in a forked stick. He fled Rome on the night of June 8, 68 AD, with a small group of companions, initially riding toward the Milvian Bridge and then taking a side road when they heard soldiers approaching. They ended up at the suburban villa of one of his freedmen named Finn, hiding in a warm outbuilding, while outside the sounds of pursuit grew closer. It was in this setting that Nero spent his last hours, and the accounts of those hours are among the most vivid. He asked his companions to help him die, to open a grave for him, and they began digging. And he wept and said, "What an artist dies in me." which may be the most quoted line from his life, and which has been interpreted in every possible direction, as vanity, as genuine grief over his artistic ambitions dying with him, as a performance, even at the end, as evidence of a man who genuinely understood himself primarily as an artist rather than as an emperor. The sound of horses approaching resolved the question of whether he would wait for the soldiers to arrive. He put a dagger to his throat, and his secretary Epaphroditus helped him press it home. The official who arrived found him already dying, and he died with the phrase, "It is too late," or possibly with some other words, depending on which source you read. He was 30 years old. He had been emperor for 14 years. The Senate and the aristocratic tradition that recorded his reign were hostile to him, for reasons that the events of his reign fully explain: the treason trials, the executions of Seneca and Petronius and Corbulo and many others, the murder of his mother and his first wife, the fire and the domus aurea, and the artistic career that the aristocracy found humiliating. All of these provided more than enough material for a hostile biographical tradition. But there are things the hostile tradition suppresses or minimizes that a complete account has to include: the early years of reasonable governance, the genuine administrative achievements of the reign, the popularity with the people of Rome, who were the bulk of the population, even if they were not the bulk of the historical record, the continuing effectiveness of the military, the maintenance of the borders, the competent handling of several genuine crises. The Senate and the aristocratic tradition that recorded his reign were hostile to him, for reasons that the events of his reign fully explain: the treason trials, the executions of Seneca and Petronius and Corbulo, the murder of his mother and his first wife, the fire and the domus aurea, and the artistic career that the aristocracy found humiliating. All of these provided more than enough material for a hostile biographical tradition. But there are things the hostile tradition suppresses or minimizes that a complete account has to include: the early years of reasonable governance, the genuine administrative achievements of the reign, the popularity with the people of Rome, who were the bulk of the population, even if they were not the bulk of the historical record, the continuing effectiveness of the military, the maintenance of the borders, the competent handling of several genuine crises. Nero's popularity with the lower classes of Rome and with the people of the eastern provinces was real and lasted long after his death. There were people in Rome who put flowers on his tomb. There were pretenders who claimed to be Nero resurrected, appearing in the East for decades after his death. 3 of them, recorded by ancient sources. The phenomenon of the false Nero was a reflection of a genuine popular feeling that whatever the aristocracy thought, whatever the Senate decreed, this man had been something to ordinary people that his successors could not easily replace. The eastern provinces had particular reason to remember him well. The Greek tours had been popular. The proclamation of freedom for Greece had been popular. The management of the Parthian question had been largely successful, and the general style of his governance, which was more theatrical and more personal than the cold administrative competence of Tiberius or Claudius, was one that translated better to the more monarch-accustomed cultures of the East than to the republican nostalgic Roman aristocracy. The Stoic opposition to Nero is one of the more interesting intellectual phenomena of his reign. Many of the philosophers and writers who were executed or exiled during the later years were Stoics, and the Stoic tradition had particular reasons for opposing a ruler who seemed to them to embody the opposite of the philosophical life they advocated. The emphasis on self-control, on reason, on the suppression of passion, on the primacy of virtue over pleasure, all of these Stoic values were violated by Nero's public persona, by his artistic performances, by his emotional extravagance, by the apparent abandonment of the restraint that Stoic philosophy considered the foundation of good character. but the Stoic tradition also produced men who managed to serve Nero for years, while maintaining their philosophical principles, and the tension within Seneca between the philosopher and the court official, between the man who wrote about the vanity of wealth and the man who accumulated one of the largest fortunes in Rome through his connection to imperial power, between the Stoic sage and the political operative. This tension is one of the most humanly interesting aspects of the whole period, and it was never resolved, only ended. The physical city that Nero inhabited and transformed is partially recoverable through archaeology. The Golden House was demolished by his successors and built over. The Colosseum was erected in the valley where its lake had been. The enormous Colossus of Nero, the 300-foot statue that stood in the vestibule of the Golden House, was repurposed and its head changed to represent various later emperors and eventually Sol, the sun god. It stood for centuries and is the probable origin of the name Colosseum for the amphitheater built near it. The sections of the Golden House that were sealed and built over rather than demolished were preserved, almost by accident, and were rediscovered. During the Renaissance, when artists, including Raphael, were lowered on ropes through holes in the ground to study the painted decoration in the buried rooms, the style of painting they found there, with its delicate architectural fantasies and mythological figures and intricate ornamental patterns, was called grotesque after the word for cave or grotto in which it was found, and this style influenced Renaissance art profoundly, so that Nero's taste in interior decoration is visible in works produced 1,500 years after his death. The poets of the Neronian era, the Silver Age of Latin literature, produced work of genuine quality and lasting importance. Lucan's Pharsalia is one of the great historical epics of Latin literature. The Satyricon of Petronius is a unique and endlessly fascinating work of fiction that gives us a view of Roman life at all social levels that no other ancient text can match. The tragedies of Seneca, whatever their relationship to his philosophical works, are remarkable dramatic pieces that were enormously influential in the European Renaissance. These cultural achievements were produced in the court of a ruler whom the senatorial tradition despised, which is one of the recurring ironies of the history of art under autocracy. The way the ancient sources handle Nero tells us something important about how ancient historiography worked and what its limitations are. The two most important sources, Tacitus and Suetonius, both wrote under Trajan and Hadrian, emperors who presented themselves as the correctors of Julio-Claudian excess, and both had strong incentives to portray the dynasty in general and its later members in particular as negatively as possible. Tacitus in particular was a senator and a man of the aristocratic tradition, and his hostility to everything that Nero represented was ideological and structural rather than simply personal. Cassius Dio, the third major source, wrote even later, under the Severan dynasty in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, and his account is further from the events and more inclined toward dramatic anecdote than toward careful historical analysis. His is the source for the fiddling while Rome burned story, which is probably false, and for various other stories that the modern historian has to treat with significant caution. This does not mean we cannot know anything about Nero. It means we have to read the sources critically, to note where they seem to be embellishing or inventing, to weight more heavily the things that hostile sources admit or acknowledge, because these are more likely to reflect genuine memory, and to use the archaeological and numismatic and documentary evidence to check and supplement the literary tradition. What emerges from this critical reading is a figure more complicated and more interesting than either the monster of the senatorial tradition or the misunderstood artist of romantic rehabilitation. A man who had been shaped by an unusual and dangerous childhood into someone with extraordinary appetites and extraordinary vulnerabilities, who had genuine gifts and genuine limitations, who governed an empire of 60 million people for 14 years, with the intermittent help of some very capable people and the persistent hindrance of his own worst impulses, who killed people he should not have killed and built things that enriched the culture even as they scandalized the aristocracy, who died at 30, having used up everything. The world that survived him was in some ways profoundly shaped by his reign. The year of the 4 emperors that followed his death was a direct consequence of the crisis his fall created. The Flavian dynasty that eventually emerged from that year of civil war built its legitimacy partly by positioning itself as the correction of Neronian excess. The Colosseum itself was a political statement as much as an entertainment venue. Built on the site of Nero's private pleasure lake and opened to the public. Look, the new regime says, what was taken from you has been given back. The Jewish revolt that Vespasian was managing when Nero died would be concluded by Vespasian and his son, Titus, and would result in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 78. One of the most consequential events in the history of Judaism and of the Christian movement that was developing out of it. This too was part of the legacy of the Neronian period, the conditions that produced the revolt, the administrative failures, the religious tensions, the escalating violence on both sides. These had been building through the whole of Nero's reign, and his successors inherited them along with everything else. The question of what kind of man Nero actually was, underneath the performances and the murders and the artistic ambitions and the political disasters, is one that cannot be answered with certainty from this distance. But there are things we can say. He was someone who seems to have genuinely loved the arts and to have found in them a kind of freedom that his political role did not permit. He was someone who had been formed by a childhood in which love and power and danger were inextricably mixed. He was capable of genuine feeling and of genuine cruelty. Sometimes, apparently simultaneously, he was afraid, probably from childhood, and certainly by the end of everything that could be taken from him, which was everything. He wanted to be remembered as an artist, as the person who said, "What an artist dies in me," and instead he is remembered as an emperor, as a monster, as a byword for excess and tyranny, as the fiddler while Rome burned, as the killer of his mother and his wife, as the persecutor of Christians, as the last of the Julio-Claudian. He is also remembered by those who read carefully as something more complicated, as a young man who was given absolute power before he was old enough to handle it, who was surrounded from birth by people who needed him to be useful to them, who was shaped by a world that demanded performance at every moment and that punished authenticity as weakness, who died at 30, having spent his whole life being watched. The oil lamps of Rome burned low after midnight. The city quieted slightly, though never completely. The Tiber moved through its banks toward the sea. The stars were visible above the smoke on clear nights. And in the apartments and the palaces and the slave quarters and the brothels and the philosophy schools and the temples and the markets and the warehouses and the bakeries of the city, 1 million people lived their lives within the shadow of one man's story. That is the story of Nero, Emperor of Rome, the last of his dynasty, 30 years old at his death, and remembered for 2,000 years. Let the city go quiet now. Let the oil lamps dim. Let the Tiber move silently through its dark banks. Somewhere the Cithara has stopped playing and the night is very still. Sleep well. The texture of daily life in Nero's Rome is something worth dwelling on, because it provides the human background against which all the political drama was playing out, and because understanding how ordinary Romans lived helps explain both the popularity that Nero had with the common people and the contempt that the aristocracy had for an emperor who sometimes seemed to prefer common pleasures to aristocratic ones. The Roman day began before dawn for most people. The bakers had been at work since the early hours of the night because wheat had to be milled and dough kneaded and bread baked before the city wanted to eat it. The bakeries were one of the central institutions of Roman urban life, and they operated across the city in large numbers. Their stone mills, powered by donkeys, walking endless circles. Their wood-fired ovens radiating heat into the narrow streets. The smell of baking bread mixing with the smell of everything else that the city contained. The poor ate simply. Bread and olive oil and occasionally olives, and sometimes a bit of fish or the cheapest cuts of meat. They ate, standing at the thermopolia, the fast food counters that lined every major street, where food was kept warm in clay vessels set into stone counters, and where you could get a bowl of hot chickpeas, or a cup of wine, or a chunk of bread for a few coins. The wealthier had kitchens in their houses, and could afford the fresh vegetables and the better cuts of meat and the imported delicacies that the markets of Rome made available from every corner of the empire. The markets themselves were remarkable institutions. The Forum Boarium near the Tiber was the ancient cattle market, one of the oldest parts of the city, now surrounded by later construction but still operating. The Forum Holatorium sold vegetables, and the Forum Piscarium sold fish from the rivers and the sea. The Emporium down on the Tiber received the goods that came upriver from Ostia, the port city at the Tiber's mouth where the grain ships from Egypt and Africa arrived, carrying the grain that fed the city's 1,000,000 people on the public dole and in the market. The public baths, the thermae, were another central institution of Roman daily life. They were open to all citizens for a minimal fee or sometimes for free, and they offered not only bathing facilities but also exercise grounds and libraries and social spaces where people of all classes could meet and talk and conduct business. The Romans bathed daily as a matter of routine hygiene and social ritual in a way that was unusual in the ancient world, and that represented a genuine public health achievement. The great aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city from the hills and mountains around it were among the most impressive engineering achievements of Roman civilization, and the baths depended on them entirely. Nero built a large public bath complex, the Thermae Neronian, in the Campus Martis, which was one of the genuine public benefits of his reign that the sources tend to give him less credit for than it deserves. Public bathing facilities were valued by the Roman population, and their provision was one of the ways an emperor demonstrated his goodwill toward the city. The baths that Nero built were later expanded by Severus Alexander and used for centuries. The theater and the circus and the amphitheater were the three great venues of Roman public entertainment, and they served different tastes and different social functions. The circus was the oldest and the most democratic. Chariot racing attracted enthusiastic crowds from every level of society, and the passion for the racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, cut across class lines in a way that few things in Roman society did. The teams had their devoted supporters who bet on their favorites, argued about their performance, mourned their defeats, and celebrated their victories with a fervor that modern sports fans would recognize immediately. The theater presented comic and tragic plays and mime performances and musical recitals and various other forms of entertainment. It was a more mixed social environment than the circus, with more formal seating arrangements that reflected status, but still broadly accessible. The mime performances in particular were enormously popular and often quite bawdy, with female performers who were among the most famous entertainers in Rome, and whose social status was legally low, but whose actual influence was considerable. The amphitheater was the venue for gladiatorial combat. The the most violent of Roman entertainments, and the one that modern sensibility finds most difficult to understand in any sympathetic register. The gladiators were mostly enslaved people and condemned criminals and prisoners of war, who had been trained in the gladiatorial schools, the ludi, to fight in the arena. But there were also free men who chose the profession for the money and the fame. And the best gladiators were genuine celebrities who attracted devoted followings, their faces appearing on cups and lamps and terra sigillata pottery sold across the empire. The gladiatorial system was also a spectacle of Roman power in a very specific sense. The displays of force and skill and endurance, the victories and defeats, and the crowd's role in deciding the fate of fallen fighters. The whole theater of the arena was connected to Romans' ideas about courage and military virtue and the proper relationship between life and death. It was not pure entertainment in the modern sense, but entertainment embedded in a complex web of religious, political, and cultural significance that made it impossible to separate from the other structures of Roman life. Nero's relationship to the gladiatorial games was complicated and revealing. He found them personally distasteful, at least in the early part of his reign, and tried to discourage lethal outcomes. He preferred the theatrical and musical entertainments that aligned with his own artistic sensibility. But he also understood that the games were politically necessary and continued to provide them as a matter of governance, even when they did not reflect his personal taste. This discrepancy between personal preference and political necessity was one of the recurring tensions of his reign. The Roman calendar was structured around religious festivals in a way that is difficult to translate into modern secular terms. There were more than 100 days of official festival per year, days when work was suspended and public ceremonies were held and games were performed in honor of various gods. The festivals structured the year and gave it rhythm. They were occasions for communal gatherings and for the renewal of the social bonds that held the city together. And the emperor's presence at the most important of them was, politically, essential as a demonstration of piety and of proper participation in the religious life of the community. The state religion of Rome was not a theology in the modern sense. It was a set of practices, rituals, ceremonies, and relationships with specific deities that the community maintained in exchange for the gods' protection and favor. The Romans understood their relationship with the gods in transactional terms. Do you te, I give, so that you may give. And the maintenance of proper ritual was understood as the mechanism by which the gods' goodwill was secured and maintained. Failure to perform the proper rituals was not just impiety, but a practical danger to the community. This pragmatic relationship with religion coexisted with genuine philosophical interest in questions about the nature of the gods and the good life. And the Stoic tradition that Seneca represented was one of several philosophical schools that offered educated Romans a framework for thinking about these questions that went beyond the transactional public religion. The Stoic God was the rational principle underlying the universe, not a person who could be bargained with, but an order to which the wise person aligned themselves. And this philosophical religion coexisted with the civic religion in a way that modern monotheistic cultures find hard to conceptualize. The Jews and the early Christians were unusual in the ancient Mediterranean for refusing to participate in the civic religion, for maintaining that their God was the only God and that the others were false. This exclusivity was bewildering and offensive to the Romans, who understood religious pluralism as the natural order of things, as a sensible recognition that different peoples had different deities, who were all in some sense real and all deserving of appropriate respect. The Jewish and Christian insistence on the falseness of other gods was not just theologically eccentric, but socially disruptive. It made Jews and Christians bad citizens from a Roman perspective, because it meant they would not participate in the communal rituals that held society together. This was the background against which Nero's persecution of the Christians in 64 AD should be understood, not as a theological conflict or a systematic program of suppression, but as an exploitation of existing suspicion and resentment against a group that was already socially marginal and that offered a convenient target for displaced anger about the fire. The persecution was terrible in its effects on those who suffered it, and historically momentous in its long-term consequences for Christianity. But it was not motivated by the theological opposition that would characterize later Roman responses to Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The slaves of Rome were another dimension of the world that any account of the era has to acknowledge. They were everywhere. They were perhaps 30 to 40% of the population of the city. They worked in every possible capacity, from the most degrading physical labor to the most sophisticated intellectual work. The imperial freedmen who ran the administrative machinery of the empire had all been slaves. The philosophers and doctors and architects and artists who served the wealthy had often been slaves. The teachers who educated the children of the aristocracy were often enslaved Greeks whose educational attainments were valued precisely because they could be purchased. The institution of slavery in Rome was not based on racial categories as modern slavery was in the Americas. It was based on legal status and the circumstances of capture or birth, and the boundary between slave and free was permeable in ways that gave enslaved people in Rome somewhat more possibility of changing their status than in some other slave systems. Manumission was common, and freed slaves became Roman citizens, and their children were full citizens. But this relative permeability does not change the fundamental violence and exploitation on which the system rested. It simply means the Roman version of slavery needs to be understood in its own terms rather than projected onto modern analogies. The Neronian era produced some of the most interesting Latin prose and poetry ever written, and the relationship between the cultural achievements of the period and the political conditions that produced them is one that literary historians have found endlessly fascinating. Seneca's philosophical essays on the shortness of life and the nature of the happy life and the proper response to adversity were written during his years of exile and during his years of court service, both experiences of a different kind of constraint, and they represent the Stoic tradition at its most accessible and its most earnest. Lucan's Pharsalia, the unfinished epic about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, was a work of enormous ambition and genuine poetic power. It took the most traumatic event in recent Roman memory and treated it in ways that were politically complex, refusing the conventional Augustan glorification of Caesar and presenting both sides of the conflict with a kind of tragic even-handedness that implicitly criticized the imperial system that had grown from Caesar's victory. It is not difficult to understand why Nero eventually found it uncomfortable and banned Lucan from publishing it, though the personal element of artistic jealousy probably also played a role. Petronius's Satyricon is the strangest and most modern-feeling text of the entire ancient world. It presents a world of freedmen and social climbers, and dinner parties of ostentatious vulgarity and sexual adventure and philosophical pretension and human comedy that feels more like a modern novel than anything else from the ancient world. The famous Cena Trimalchionis, the Dinner of Trimalchio, in which a grotesquely wealthy freedman hosts an enormously elaborate dinner and reveals at every turn the gap between his aspirations to aristocratic culture and his inability to achieve it, is one of the great set pieces of world literature and gives us a view of Neronian Rome from the social middle that no other text provides. The relationship between Nero and the arts was not purely self-interested. He genuinely seems to have valued cultural achievement for its own sake, and to have created an environment in which artistic production was encouraged and rewarded. The Neronia were games he established in 60 AD on the Greek model, with competitions in music and poetry and athletics and horsemanship held every 5 years, which represented a genuine attempt to elevate artistic competition to the same civic importance that athletic competition had traditionally held. The aristocracy disliked them intensely because the musical competitions were incompatible with their understanding of appropriate aristocratic behavior. But the games were popular, and they reflected Nero's genuine cultural values. He also apparently wrote poetry that some contemporaries admired, though whether the admiration was genuine or politically motivated is impossible to determine at this distance. Suetonius and others quote fragments and describe the manner of composition, noting that Nero worked on his verses carefully and revised them, which is at least the behavior of someone who took the craft seriously, rather than simply performing the role of poet for political effect. The physical appearance of Nero is preserved through the portrait tradition in sculpture and on coins, and it gives us a picture of a man who looked like what he was, a young man of the ruling family. With the regular features and the careful grooming and the slightly soft quality that a life of privilege produces, the coins show a face that changes over the reign from the boyish portrait of the early years to something heavier and less defined in the later issues, which may reflect the actual physical changes that the ancient sources describe when they talk about his complexion and his figure deteriorating in the later years. The climate of Rome in the 1st century was warmer than today by perhaps 1 or 2 degrees. The Mediterranean basin was in a period of Roman warm, period that supported agriculture and facilitated the supply lines that fed the empire. But it also meant that the summer in Rome was brutally hot in ways that the city's densely packed population experienced in their bodies every day. The wealthy had their country villas to retreat to, the seaside resorts of the Bay of Naples, where Bai and Cumi and Puteoli offered cool sea breezes and pleasurable diversions. But the poor stayed in the city and endured the heat in the upper floors of their insulate, where the heat accumulated and the smell concentrated and disease spread easily in the conditions of summer. The fear of fire was constant and justified. The Roman fire watch, the vigils, patrolled the city at night and had pumping equipment and buckets and hooks for pulling down burning buildings to create fire breaks. But the density of the city and the prevalence of open flame for cooking and heating and lighting meant that fires were frequent and often severe. The Great Fire of 64 AD was the worst in living memory, but it was not unique in kind, only in scale. Nero's response to the fire included not only the relief measures and the reconstruction program, but also a systematic attempt to attribute blame. And the displacement of that blame onto the Christians was not the only unusual element. There were also accusations against various individuals and groups of arson that may have reflected genuine investigation or may have been exploitation of the disaster for political purposes. The normal Roman response to a catastrophe of this scale included both practical measures and the search for human or divine agency to blame, and Nero engaged in both. The rebuilding of Rome after the fire was supervised by Nero personally and represented genuine urban planning of a kind the city had never seen. The old Rome had grown organically over centuries with no systematic plan. Streets following ancient cattle paths, buildings crowding into every available space. The result being a city that was beautiful in its monuments and chaotic in its fabric. The new regulations that Nero imposed required wider streets, required building materials that were less flammable, required that buildings have their own walls rather than sharing walls with neighbors, which helped slow the spread of fire, required porticos and spaces between buildings. Some of these regulations were maintained in the rebuilding, and some were gradually relaxed as the pressure of housing a million people reasserted itself, and the old patterns of crowding and cheapness overwhelmed the elegant new plan. But the effort was genuine, and the results, to the extent they were maintained, were real improvements in the fabric of the city. The Domus Aurea itself, whatever else it was a work of architectural and decorative innovation that influenced building design for generations. The rotating dining room that the sources describe, the dining room that turned continuously like the sphere of the heavens, powered by machinery of some kind that the sources do not describe precisely enough for modern engineers to reconstruct with certainty, was an extraordinary piece of mechanical ambition that reflected both the technical sophistication of Roman engineering and Nero's particular taste for the spectacular and the theatrical. The painted decoration of the Golden House, created by an artist named Fabulus, who apparently wore a toga even when working on the ceilings, and who painted only for a few hours each day as the light in the sealed rooms required, established a style of interior decoration that blended architectural illusion with mythological narrative and ornamental detail in ways that Renaissance artists found profoundly inspiring. The rooms that Raphael and his contemporaries were lowered into to study in the early 16th century had been underground for nearly 1,500 years, sealed and preserved by the very act of building over them that was intended to erase them. The relationships among the members of the imperial family and the court in the Neronian period were conducted against the backdrop of an awareness of mortality and sudden reversal that made every friendship and every enmity more intense than ordinary human relationships. People who stood close to the emperor were people who might at any moment be required to choose between their principles and their survival. People who fell out of favor were people who might have days or weeks before the accusation came and the soldiers arrived. This awareness shaped everything: the way people spoke to each other, the way they wrote letters that might be read by hostile eyes, the way they conducted their friendships, the way they managed their artistic and intellectual and philosophical lives in relation to the political realities that constrained them. The Stoic tradition offered one way of navigating this: the cultivation of an inner freedom that the outer circumstances could not touch. And several of the figures of the Neronian period, Seneca in his withdrawal, Petronius in his theatrical dying, the poet Persius, who published his sharp social satires while remaining carefully obscure, found different versions of this inner space. The role of women in the Neronian court was, as at all points in Roman history, complex and in practice more powerful than the formal structures of law and custom suggested. Agrippina's influence in the early reign was the most visible example. But women throughout the aristocracy exercised informal power through their relationships with their husbands and brothers and sons, through the management of household finances that in wealthy families could be enormous, through the networks of social connection that the patronage system depended on, through the private conversations that were never recorded in official sources, but that shaped the decisions of the men who did appear in those sources. The freedwomen of the imperial household were another category of female power. The women who served as personal attendants and secretaries and companions to the imperial family had access to emperors and empresses that many senators could not achieve, and their influence was informal but real. Nero's freedwoman companion is the most sympathetic figure in his personal life, partly because she seems to have genuinely cared for him, rather than using him, and partly because she is one of the few people whose loyalty to him survived his fall and extended to caring for his burial. The Stoic philosophers of the period, who had such a complicated relationship with Nero's court, were part of a broader tradition of philosophical education that reached into every level of the educated Roman world. There were Stoics and Epicureans and Platonists and skeptics teaching in Rome and in every major city of the empire. And philosophical education was considered as much a part of the formation of a complete Roman gentleman as rhetorical training or military service. The idea that one should think carefully about how to live and what was worth having and how to face adversity was not confined to professional philosophers, but was part of the general culture of the educated class. The Epicurean school, whose master had taught that pleasure was the highest good, but had defined pleasure primarily as the absence of pain and the cultivation of friendship and tranquility, was particularly popular with the wealthy who had the leisure to pursue it, and who found in it a philosophical justification for the pleasures their wealth could provide. But genuine Epicureans were also much more austere than this suggests, and the Garden of Epicurus in Athens was famous for simple living rather than luxury. The popular conception of Epicureanism as mere hedonism was already current in the ancient world, and already a distortion. The roads that connected Rome to every part of the empire were one of the great practical achievements of Roman civilization, and they shaped everything about how the empire worked. They were engineered to last, built with layers of crushed stone and concrete and paved with large stone slabs. They ran straight where the terrain allowed, because straight roads were faster and easier to maintain. They crossed rivers on stone bridges and went through mountains in tunnels, and they connected the farthest corners of the peripire to the center with a reliability that was genuinely astonishing for the era. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, used these roads to transmit official communications from Rome to every province with a speed that was not matched in Europe again until the 19th century. Relay stations provided fresh horses at regular intervals, and official dispatches could travel hundreds of miles in a day. The governors and generals and administrators who ran the empire communicated with Rome through this system, and Rome communicated back. And the speed of this communication was part of what made it possible to govern such an enormous territory from a single center. But the roads also carried armies, and this was their most immediately political function in the crisis year of 68 The legions on the Rhine could be at the Alps in weeks if they moved. The legions in Spain could reach Italy. The legions on the Danube, the armies in Syria, all of them connected by the road system to Rome and to each other. And the question of which legions were loyal to whom was ultimately the question that resolved the succession crisis that Nero's fall created. The year of the 4 emperors, 69 AD, which followed Nero's death, was the most explicit demonstration of the truth that had underlain the Principate from its beginning, that the emperor's power rested on military force, that when the legions were divided, the empire was divided, that republican institutions had no independent weight, but were simply the decorative language in which military domination expressed itself. 4 men claimed the throne in that year: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, and each of them held power only as long as the soldiers supported them, and lost it when the soldiers changed their minds. Galba was old and austere, and told the soldiers he would maintain military discipline rather than buying their loyalty with large bonuses, which was admirable in principle and fatal in practice. He was killed by the Praetorians in the Forum after ruling for 7 months. Otho, who had supported him and expected to be his heir, succeeded him but was defeated by the legions of the Rhine who had declared for Vitellius. and Otho committed suicide in April 69 AD with a composure that the ancient sources found impressive. He was 36, and he had been emperor for 3 months. Vitellius was fat and indulgent, and apparently genuinely fond of food in ways that the sources treat as a moral failing and that modern readers find more humanizing than the sources intend. He was defeated and killed when the legions of the East, commanded by Vespasian, who had been managing the Jewish revolt, declared for their general. Vitellius was killed in December 69 AD after ruling for 8 months, and Vespasian became emperor and founded the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was an unlikely emperor in the sense that he came from a family of no great distinction and had risen through the military and administrative hierarchy purely on ability. He was a practical and capable and somewhat coarse man, was not interested in philosophical refinement or artistic performance, and who found the Neronian style of governance as bewildering as the senatorial tradition did. But he was also competent and honest, and his 10-year reign restored the stability that the previous decade had destroyed. His response to the memory of Nero was to bury it, literally in some cases, demolishing the Domos Aurea and building over it, filling in the artificial lake and building the Colosseum in its place as an explicit statement about the new regime's relationship to the public. The building of the Colosseum was funded in part by the spoils of the Jewish war from the looting of the temple in Jerusalem, which was itself a remarkable historical connection. The most famous building in Rome paid for with the treasures of the temple, whose destruction was one of the defining events of Jewish and Christian history. The memory of Nero in the immediate decades after his death was shaped by these political acts as well as by the literary tradition. The Flavian dynasty needed him to be a monster to justify their own legitimacy. The senators who wrote history under Trajan and Hadrian needed him to be a monster to justify the opposition they celebrated. And the Christians who were developing their theological tradition in the 2nd and 3rd centuries found in him a convenient antitype, the embodiment of pagan imperial evil against which the purity of the martyrs could be defined. But the flowers on his tomb persisted, and the false Neros appeared in the East, and the people who had loved him, or at least had not hated him, maintained their own memory of what he had been, which was something more complicated and more human than the monster the official tradition required. The Roman Empire under the Flavians, and then under the 5 good emperors of the 2nd century, achieved a level of stability and prosperity that was, in many ways, greater than anything the Julio-Claudian period had managed. And yet the Julio-Claudians, with all their drama and their failures and their extraordinary personalities, are the emperors that history remembers most vividly, that have attracted the most sustained literary and artistic attention, that feel most alive in the imagination, and Nero is perhaps the most vivid of them all. This is partly because the sources are more detailed and more personal about the Julio-Claudians than about later dynasties, partly because the period produced a literary culture of extraordinary quality that has preserved the texture of the era in ways that later periods lack, and partly because there is something in the human drama of the Julio-Claudian story, the combination of absolute power and human weakness, of great ambition and catastrophic failure, of intelligence and self-destruction, that resonates across the centuries in ways that more successful and more stable reigns do not. Nero is not a hero, and not a simple villain, and not a case study in mental illness, and not a misunderstood artist who was only doing his best. He is a person shaped by specific circumstances, who made specific choices in a specific world, and the complexity of that person and those choices is what makes the story worth telling and worth hearing on a quiet night when the world has gone still and history feels very close. The chariot wheels have stopped. The bakers have put out their ovens. The Tiber is moving silently between its ancient banks. The hills of Rome are dark against a sky full of stars. And somewhere in the darkness, the story is still there, still moving, still making its slow way toward the inevitable morning. Rest now, the story will keep until you wake. The medicine of first-century Rome is another world that the people living in the Neronian era inhabited daily. It was a medicine that combined genuine observation and accumulated practical knowledge with frameworks that were fundamentally mistaken. The humoral theory derived from Hippocrates, and Galen held that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood and phlegm, and yellow bile and black bile, and that health consisted in the proper balance of these humors, and disease in their imbalance. Treatments were designed to restore balance by removing excess humors through bleeding or purging or inducing sweating or adjusting diet. Within this wrong framework, Roman doctors accumulated considerable practical knowledge. They understood basic surgery and performed amputations and cataract operations and wound care with reasonable effectiveness. They understood the pharmacological properties of numerous plants and used in compounded medicines that sometimes actually worked. They understood the importance of clean water and adequate food to general health, even if they lacked the germ theory that would explain why these things mattered. The great physician Galen was not yet practicing in Nero's time, but the tradition he would codify was already well established. And the question of who had access to good medical care was as sharply determined by wealth as it is in most societies. The wealthy had personal physicians, often educated Greeks, whose knowledge was the best available. The poor had folk medicine and the public physicians that some cities maintained, and the luck of their own constitutions. Disease was a constant presence in the lives of everyone in ancient Rome, and the summer in particular was a season of fear. The malaria that was endemic in the Tiber marshes south of Rome killed people every summer. The diseases of crowding that spread in the insulae were chronic and often fatal. Smallpox and typhus and dysentery and tuberculosis moved through the city's population with a regularity that made death a familiar companion in ways that modern people in wealthy countries cannot easily imagine. The way the Romans thought about death was shaped by this familiarity with it, and by the philosophical traditions that offered frameworks for facing it. The Stoic tradition in particular had a great deal to say about death and about the proper attitude toward it. Seneca wrote repeatedly and beautifully about death, about the importance of not fearing it, about the way that the certainty of death gives urgency and meaning to the life that precedes it, about the freedom that comes from accepting mortality rather than fighting it. The Roman funeral was an elaborate social ritual that served both practical purposes and important functions in maintaining the connections between the living and the dead. The body was laid out in the home and washed and dressed and mourned for several days. Professional mourners were hired who wailed and beat their breasts in demonstrations of grief that supplemented the genuine grief of the family. The funeral procession through the city was a statement of the deceased's social position and the depth of the community's loss. And the cremation or burial was accompanied by ceremonies that maintained the proper relationship between the living and the spirits of the dead. The Romans took the afterlife seriously, but in a way that was different from the Christian framework that would eventually replace it. They believed in the shades of the dead, the Lares and the Manes and the Lemures, spirits that required propitiation and that could bring harm if neglected. And the Parentalia and the Lemuria were festivals that maintained the proper relationship between the living community and the dead. The underworld of Roman mythology, with its division into regions of punishment and reward, and the pale plains, where most shades wandered without distinction, was a less vivid and less morally urgent afterlife than the heaven and hell of Christianity. It was a landscape of diminishment, rather than judgment. The relationship between Rome and the provinces during Nero's reign was experienced very differently depending on which province you were in and what your social position within it was. The eastern provinces, Greece and Asia Minor and Syria and Egypt, were in many cases older and more culturally sophisticated than Rome itself. They had their own deep histories and their own artistic and philosophical traditions. And the Romans who governed them were governing people who in many cases had been civilized longer than the Romans had. The governors of these provinces were drawn from the senatorial class and served for terms of 1 to 3 years. They were responsible for military security and tax collection and judicial administration and the maintenance of order. They had enormous practical power within their provinces and almost no accountability to anyone except the emperor, which meant that the quality of provincial governance varied enormously depending on the individual governor's character and competence. The tax system of the empire was one of the more complex institutions of Roman governance. The direct taxes on land and persons in the provinces provided the bulk of imperial revenue and were collected through a combination of direct imperial collection and farming out to publicani, private contractors who paid the government a lump sum and then collected the taxes themselves at a profit. The publicani had a long and unhappy history as exploiters of provincial populations, and one of the reforms that Nero made in 58 AD was to reduce their power and post their rates publicly so that taxpayers could know what they were legally required to pay. This reform was one of the more genuinely popular acts of Nero's reign, and it represented real engagement with the problem of provincial exploitation. But it was also expensive in terms of imperial revenue because it reduced the profit margin of the collection system, and the subsequent financial pressures contributed to the tax increases and the confiscations of the later reign. The grain supply to Rome was one of the most politically sensitive responsibilities of the imperial government. The unknowna, the grain supply system, delivered grain from Egypt and North Africa and Sicily to feed the city's population, and the failure of the grain supply was one of the few things that could provoke the Roman mob to genuine dangerous disorder. The emperors maintained a careful watch on the grain supply, and Nero, like his predecessors, was attentive to this, though the pressures of his building program and his other spending created periodic strains in the supply system that were managed with varying degrees of success. The harbors at Puteoli, on the Bay of Naples, and Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, were the entry points for the grain ships, and Claudius had begun construction of an artificial harbor at Ostia to improve the capacity of the port, a project that Nero continued. The harbor infrastructure was essential to the supply chain, and its improvement was a genuine contribution to the economic functioning of the empire, even if it lacks the drama of the other things. Nero is remembered for the Roman army in Nero's time was a professional force of approximately 150,000 to 170,000 legionary soldiers, organized into roughly 28 legions of approximately 5,500 men each, supplemented by roughly equal numbers of auxiliary troops drawn from the provincial populations. This force was stationed at the frontiers of the empire and was not, in most circumstances, present in Italy or near Rome. The Praetorian Guard of approximately 9,000 men was the exception, the only significant military force in central Italy, and their political importance, demonstrated repeatedly through the Julio-Claudian period, was entirely out of proportion to their military size. The legions were stationed on the Rhine frontier, facing the Germanic tribes, on the Danube frontier, facing the Dacians and Sarmatians, and various other peoples, in Britain, in Syria, facing Parthia, in Egypt, in North Africa, in Spain, and they spent their time building roads and fortifications and training and occasionally fighting when the barbarian peoples on the other side of the frontier made incursions, or when the empire decided to expand or consolidate its position. The legionary soldier's life was hard. The training was intensive. The discipline was harsh. The service was 25 years, and the pay was adequate but not generous. After service, the soldier received a grant of land or money and citizenship if he did not already have it, and these benefits were sufficient to maintain recruitment, even in an era when military service was clearly dangerous and demanding. The Germanic tribes that faced the Roman legions on the Rhine were not the primitive savages of Roman propaganda, but complex societies with their own political structures and their own sophisticated warrior cultures. The memory of the Varian disaster, the destruction of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest in 09 AD, was still present in Roman military thinking. It was the single greatest military disaster Rome had suffered in living memory, and it had established a permanent caution about projecting Roman power too far beyond the Rhine. Nero's military record was in practice more solid than his reputation suggests. The campaigns in Britain continued under his reign with mixed results. The Boudiccan revolt was a serious military crisis that tested the Roman system severely, but its suppression demonstrated the resilience of the Roman military machine and the competence of its commanders. The Parthian settlement achieved by Julio represented genuine diplomatic and military success in one of the most complicated frontier situations the empire faced, and the management of the German frontier was on the whole competent, even if it lacked the dramatic victories that would have given his reign a more satisfying military narrative. The intellectual life of Rome in the Neronian era was conducted in the libraries and the lecture halls and the private homes of the educated class, and it was a remarkably rich and diverse intellectual environment by the standards of any era. Philosophy, rhetoric, history, poetry, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, jurisprudence, all of these fields had practitioners of genuine distinction, and the combination of Roman administrative practicality and Greek philosophical tradition had produced a synthesis that was capable of generating important work in all these domains. The libraries of Rome were both public and private. Julius Caesar had planned a great public library that Augustus had eventually built and that stood in the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine. There were other public libraries in the great basilicas and temple complexes, and wealthy private citizens maintained extensive personal collections that were accessible to those in their social networks. The books themselves were papyrus rolls stored in wooden cylindrical cases. Read aloud in the normal fashion, since silent reading was unusual in the ancient world, and the production and copying of texts was a significant industry conducted largely by enslaved people with literary training. The question of what survives and what was lost is one that haunts the study of classical antiquity. What we have of Nero's era is a fraction of what existed. We have Seneca and Tacitus and Suetonius and Petronius and Lucan, but we have lost enormously more. The historians who wrote before Tacitus and whose work he used, the contemporary accounts of events, the official records, the poetry and philosophy and drama that the ancient sources mention but that has not survived. All of this represents a gap in our knowledge that cannot be bridged, and that means our understanding of the Neronian era is always partial, always based on what happened to be copied through the medieval scriptoria, rather than what was most important or most representative at the time. This incompleteness is a fundamental condition of ancient history, and it shapes everything about how we tell these stories. We work with the evidence we have, and we acknowledge its limitations, and we try to be honest about the difference between what we know and what we are inferring, and what we simply cannot know, and the result is always something less than the full reality of a living era. always a reconstruction from fragments, always approximate. But the fragments are extraordinary, and the reconstruction they enable, incomplete as it is, gives us access to a world that was fully human in all the ways that matter. A world of ambition and fear and love and cruelty and art and politics and the ordinary texture of daily life that the monuments and the battles and the emperors were embedded in. And that texture is what makes the history worth studying and worth telling. The night deepens over Rome. The stars wheel above the 7 hills. The Tiber moves in its ancient banks toward the sea. The city is quiet in the way that a city of 1 million people is never quite fully quiet. There is always someone awake, always something moving in the dark, always some small sound that belongs to the continuous life of the place. 2,000 years have passed, and the hills are still there, and the river is still there, and the stones of the old roads still run straight toward. And the story that played out among all of this, the story of a young man with a Sithora and a burning city and a complicated soul, is still moving through the world, still asking its questions, still waiting for an answer that the evidence will probably never quite provide. That is all right. The questions are worth asking, even without answers. The story is worth telling, even without resolution. History is not a trial, and Nero is not a verdict. He is a person in a world, and the world is still here, and so is he. In the records, and the ruins, and the long human memory that keeps Torten stories alive across the centuries, because they touch something that does not change. Sleep now, the lamps are out, the emperor is gone, and Rome endures.